Great. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Um, Broadly speaking, the research question that I'm invested in these days, it can be summarized as what the hell happened to the old good internet? Yes, the people who ran the old good internet were pretty surveillance happy, and they were usually willing to share their data with the NSA. And whenever there was a conflict between the security of their users or the growth of the firm, it was always YOLO, let's grow. But Google search actually used to work. And Facebook used to show you posts from people that you followed. And Uber used to be both cheaper than a taxi and pay the drivers more than taxi drivers. Amazon once sold products and not these mystery items that are come from brands whose names are all consonants. And Apple used to actually defend your privacy rather than spying on you with a device that you're not allowed to modify to protect your privacy on. There was a time where if you used Spotify to search for an album, that was what you got. Not like today, where what you get when you search on Spotify is an AI-generated insipid playlist that has the same title as the album and also the same artwork as the album. Microsoft, once upon a time, actually sold software, and notwithstanding that that fact was often buggy and that software was often buggy, what Microsoft does now is they only let you access apps in the cloud. They observe your use of those apps. They pick out the features that are most valuable to you, and then they take them out of the basic tier and sell them back to you as an upsell. So this is my research question. What the hell happened to the old good internet? Now, the word that I coined to describe this funny word, which has really caught on, I think, because people like a minor license to be a little vulgar, that word is enshittification. And from the outside, enshittification is a very characteristic progression. First, you have platforms that are good to their end users. So Google put the best search results at the top of your search. Facebook showed you a feed of posts from the people that you were following. Uber charged you small dollars to get in a taxi. Amazon subsidized goods and returns and put the best things at the top of their search results. And that was stage one. It's being good to end users. But there's a second stage kind of built into stage one, which is figuring out how to lock those users in. And there's a lot of ways to lock in an end user. Facebook's users actually do the lock-in for Facebook because you joined Facebook because you wanted to hang out with the other people who are already there. And then other people joined Facebook so they could be there with you. You know, economists, they call this the network effect. You've doubtless heard of it. And with network effects come another idea from economics, which is the collective action problem, which is to say that you and your friends all agree that you're not enjoying Facebook anymore, and you all love each other and want to go somewhere else together, but you cannot possibly agree on where to go next or when you should leave. And so you're all stuck on Facebook. You're there because you have a rare disease, and that's where the support group for that disease is hanging out. And you've got a best friend who's there because they've left their home country, and that's where all the people from their home country are hanging out. It's how they stay in touch with them. And there's a friend who coordinates their kids' Little League carpools on Facebook. And there's a dungeon master whose customers are all on Facebook. And so you're all stuck because even if you can convince those friends to leave, they can't convince all those other people to leave. And so Facebook comes at a very high cost, your privacy, your dignity, maybe your sanity, but that's still less than the switching cost of leaving Facebook, which is losing contact with all those communities that matter to you. So your friends have taken you hostage and you're taking your friends hostage. Now, there are other ways of locking in users. Users can be locked in with money. So Amazon has convinced the vast majority of American households to buy Prime. They prepay a year in advance for shipping. And that virtually guarantees that if you're looking to buy something, you're going to start searching for it on Amazon. Why wouldn't you? You've already paid to have the shipping there. Sometimes firms lock you in with digital rights management. We're all familiar with that. But sometimes it's a grab bag. So think about Apple. You can't run an iOS app unless you have iOS hardware. And you can't run the media that Apple sells you, music, books, and movie, unless you have an iOS app. Your iPhone uses parts pairing. So this is DRM at the component level so that you can only get it fixed by an official Apple manufacturer, service depot who uses official Apple parts. And every one of those parts in your iPhone has a microscopic Apple logo engraved on it, so that if that iPhone somehow escapes Apple's own disposal system where they shred them, makes it to the Far East, is broken down for parts and shipped back into the US, Apple files claims with US Customs and Border Patrol to say that these devices are now counterfeits when they enter the country because the state of those components is unknown and they bear an Apple trademark. and therefore this is tarnishment of their trademark to re-import these into the US. So actual OEM parts can't even be found for your phone. This is thinking very different. So getting you locked in by whichever means, this completes the first phase of enshittification, and that is the signal for the second phase to start, which is when they make things worse for end users, but make things better for their business customers, because a platform mediates between business customers and end users. For example, platforms might start poisoning their search results to benefit businesses. Google sells more and more of that results page to people who want to put something off the top of the Google search, whether or not it's the best match for the Google search. And then the thing that identifies that as an ad goes into smaller and smaller and grayer type so that you as a user are more likely to click on it. Amazon does this too. They sell off their search results. They call it an ad sales business. It's not. It's search priority. They make $38 billion a year selling the search result to their own merchants. If you click the first result on an Amazon search, on average, you pay 29% more than the best match for your search on Amazon. The first row costs 25% more than the best match on Amazon. And on average, the best result on Amazon can be found about 17 places down on a search result page. Other platforms, they sell your feed, like Facebook, which at one point started selling you the thing, was showing you the things that you asked to see, right? Their pitch was, tell us what you want to follow and we'll make you a feed made up of that. But increasingly, the quantum of content from the stuff you've asked to follow on Facebook has dwindled to a kind of homeopathic residue. And this leaves behind a giant void that Facebook can stuff full of paid ads and paid boosted content, things that people will pay to show you stuff. And of course, at this point, you might be thinking, well, I know how this works. Because you're not paying for the product, you're the product. But that is an absolute nonsense. The people who are buying the Google ads, they pay more every year for ads that have lower fidelity targeting and a higher degree of ad fraud. The publishers that pay to non-consensually cram stuff into your eyeballs on Facebook, they have to do that because Facebook has dialed down the reach of the stuff that they post, even to the people who've asked to see it. Amazon sellers who have the best match for your query, they're banished to page umpty million of the Amazon search result page unless they bid against people who are willing to spend more money on search result priority and less money on quality of goods or price matching. It costs so much to sell on Amazon that an aggregate between 45 and 51% of every dollar you spend on Amazon is captured by Don Bezos and the Amazon crime family. No seller on Amazon has a 51% margin. They have to raise their prices to avoid losing money on every sale. But things on Amazon don't cost more than they do everywhere else. How do we resolve this paradox? Well, Amazon forces merchants to raise their prices everywhere if they raise their prices on Amazon. Amazon enforces a policy called most favored nation, where Amazon has to have your best price, which means that Amazon takes 45 to 51 cents out of every dollar. Merchants raise their prices to recapture that money, and then they raise that price everywhere else, whether that's Target, a mom and pop store, or their own website. And so prices go up across the board because of this. Now, these are Amazon's best customers. They are paying for the product, but they are still getting screwed. Paying for the product does not fill some vapid tech boss's shriveled heart with so much joy that he decides to give a consumer a fair deal. Look at Apple. Remember when Apple offered every iOS user a one-click opt-out of third-party surveillance? And 96% of iOS users clicked that box. We have to assume the other 4% were either Facebook employees or drunk, or people who got drunk because they worked at Facebook. And when Facebook did their annual investor call after this, they announced that this decision was costing them $10 billion a year, which I know you love to see. But at the very same time as Apple was safeguarding its users' privacy and reflecting their real preferences about surveillance, they started spying on iOS users to gather the very same data that Facebook was no longer allowed to gather from users who had opted out of commercial surveillance in order to power their own rival surveillance ad network. Your iPhone is not an ad-supported gimme. You paid $1,000 for the distraction rectangle in your pocket, and you are still the product. What's more, Apple has rigged iOS so that you cannot mod that OS to block that surveillance. So if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. If you are paying for the product, You're still the product. So please, let's stop saying if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. So that is phase 2 of enshittification. Phase 1, be good to users, find a way to lock them in. Phase 2, make things worse for users in order to make things better for business customers and get them locked in. And phase 3, screw everyone, take all the available surplus back for the shareholders and the executives. Leave behind the absolute bare minimum of utility so that everyone stays locked into this thing that is rapidly turning into a pile of shit. This is enshittification. It's a tragedy in 3 acts. So that's what enshittification looks like from the outside. But what's going on inside the company? What is the pathological mechanism? What sci-fi entropy ray are these tech bosses aiming at their own products that cause them to decay so quickly? I call this mechanism twiddling. And it refers to the nature of digital platforms, which is they are so flexible that they allow tech bosses to reach into the back end and change the values and weights on all of the business logic. How much they pay, how much things cost, how things are ranked in their search, what the recommendation criteria are, and other foundational aspects of the system. And digital platforms are twiddler's utopia. You know, if you're a grocer and you want to reprice the eggs because you've had someone walk in the store who you think is probably really hungry for an omelet, you will need an army of teenagers on roller skates with pricing guns to go around and change all the prices on all the eggs. But if you're Amazon Fresh, all you have to do is move a slider and the price of the eggs goes up. And we see this everywhere digital business takes hold. So McDonald's Investments has a portfolio company called Plexure. And Plexure advertises that they can combine surveillance dossiers non-consensually harvested from merchants' customers with dynamic pricing. And the example that they use in their promotional materials is if you go to the drive-up window for your breakfast sandwich and the surveillance data calculates that today is the day you get paid, they can make that breakfast sandwich cost $1 more. And of course, as William Gibson, the great prophet, told us, cyberspace is averting. The things that live in the digital world are moving out into the physical world. So with digital shelf tags, grocers can twiddle the price when you walk into the shop. And in Norway, where e-ink grocery shelf tags are now the norm, grocers are changing prices 3,000 times a day. Now, this isn't just about retail, it's also about labor. Every Uber driver gets offered a different wage for every ride that they take. That is a personalized wage that is calculated dynamically based on how selective the driver has recently been. If the driver has been recently more selective and not clocked on for jobs that were offered, Uber tightens up the wage that they're offered. But once they become less selective, once they start taking jobs without being so picky, then the wage starts to drop down. But it's done on a random schedule and in very small increments that you have to pay very close attention to even notice. This is something the law professor Veena Dubal calls algorithmic wage discrimination. And it's a prime example of twiddling. But every kind of digital worker gets twiddled, right? If you're a YouTuber, you get twiddled. You spend thousands of dollars, hundreds of hours, you make a video, and then YouTube, according to criteria you're not allowed to know or inspect, decides that your video won't be shown even to the people who subscribe to it, even to people who search for it by name. And they say, we can't tell you what criteria we use to decide whether or not this labor that you performed will reward you, because if we did, then you would be able to figure out what our criteria are and cheat, right? Content moderation is the last domain in which we take security through obscurity seriously, and in which no one says, wait a second, that's not how security works. And as a result, YouTube is the kind of crummy boss who takes money out of your paycheck every week for breaking rules that you're not allowed to know about in case you figure out how to cheat and get your full pay packet, even though you made your boss upset in some way. Now, twiddling does sometimes work in users' favor. Sometimes platforms twiddle to make things better for their business customers, not just worse for their business customers. For example, a Forbes reporter called Emily Baker White broke a story about something in the back end of TikTok called the heating tool. And the heating tool overrides the content recommendation algorithm to just flood a bunch of random users' feeds with one performer's content. So why would they do this? Why would they just give away views like this? Well, here's an analogy from my own boyhood. I grew up in Toronto. I'm a Canadian. We're like serial killers. We're everywhere. We look just like everyone else. And in Toronto, every summer, we had a traveling fair that would come to the city, the Canadian National Exhibition, the AXE. And they had a midway. And if you went down to the midway, by about 10 o'clock every morning, there'd be some poor sucker walking around with a gargantuan teddy bear. Now, normally the way you win the giant teddy bear is by throwing 5 balls in a peach basket. But to a first approximation, no one has ever gotten 5 balls in that peach basket. Instead, what's happened is some carny has pulled out a likely looking sucker and said, hey, you, I like the look of your face. Tell you what, you get 1 ball in the peach basket. I'm going to give you a keychain. You get a 2nd ball in the peach basket. I'll give you another keychain. You can trade them for a teddy bear. And so why is the carny giving away giant teddy bears? Because it turns that guy into a walking billboard for a game that you cannot win. If that dopey looking Judas goat can win the giant teddy bear, well, then you should plunk down $5 and try and win the giant teddy bear, but you cannot. TikTok's heating tool is a way to give away tactical giant teddy bears. When someone at the TikTok Brain Trust decides that there aren't enough sports bros making content on the platform, they grab a random sports bro out of their performer pool and they make him king for the day. And because this guy doesn't know what's going on the back end, he assumes that he's just very good at TikTok. And he goes around and he tells all the other sports bros, there's gold in them thar hills. Come and be a sports bro on TikTok and we will all get rich. Now, the other people who pile in, they don't do as well as him. And they assume they're bad at TikTok because they don't know what's going on the back end, because they can't see the twiddling. They assume that there is a consistent and fair business logic being applied to all business customers of this platform. And so eventually the TikTok Brain Trust, they decide, well, you know, we've got enough sports pros locked in. Let's take away the heat from that one guy who's been going around calling himself the Louis Pasteur of sports content on TikTok. And let's give it to some astrologer and get the astrologers to pile in. Giant teddy bears, they're everywhere you look. Uber drivers who were boasting to the New York Times 10 years ago about how they were making $90,000 a year, they were getting giant teddy bears. Substackers who were rolling in dough when Substack kicked off, giant teddy bears. Joe Rogan and getting $200 million from Spotify, giant teddy bears. Those people are all the proud owners of the largest teddy bears you can imagine. And those teddy bears are a steal for the companies to give away, because every dollar that the platform spends on a giant teddy bear turns into $10 worth of free labor from performers who think that they can get a giant teddy bear too. Giant teddy bears, they're just another way of twiddling. Platforms can play games with every part of the business logic in highly automated ways. And this allows them to quickly and efficiently siphon value so that it moves from business users to end users and then back again, and then eventually lands in the shareholders' pockets. So that is the how. This is how platforms do the trick where they're good to users, lock users in, maltreat those users in order to lure in business customers, and then take all the value away from those business customers for themselves. So that is what is happening, and that is how it's happening. But what this doesn't answer is why it's happening. And there's a kind of easy answer to why it's happening. These businesses aren't charity, right? The more money they spend on quality, the more money they spend on suppliers or wages, the less they charge for goods and services, the less free capital there is to return to shareholders and executives. So obviously that's a simple answer for why it's happening, but what it doesn't explain is why it's happening now. I mean, these companies were digital 20 years ago. They were for-profit enterprises 20 years ago, but they didn't do this 20 years ago. Or at least the successful ones didn't. There were companies who did it. They turned themselves into giant piles of shit, but then they were treated like giant piles of shit. We avoided them and they died. Do you remember MySpace, Yahoo, LiveJournal? If you go to those domains, you will find some kind of AI slop or programmatic ads, but those actual companies, they're effectively gone. And that's the clue. It used to be that if you enshittified your product, bad things happened to your company. Now there are no consequences for enshittification and everyone does it. So this is the crux of how we got enshittified. What stops companies from enshittifying? There are 4 forces that discipline digital companies. The first is obviously competition, markets. If your companies find it easy to leave, then you have to worry about them leaving. And many factors can contribute to how easy it is to depart a platform. We talked about how Facebook has network effects, but the most important factor about whether users can leave is whether there's anywhere else to go. Now, back in 2012, Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion. That may seem like chunk change in these days of 11-digit big tech acquisitions, but that was a large sum in those innocent days. And it was an especially big sum to pay for a company like Instagram, which only had 13 employees, had 25 million registered users, and most of them weren't logging in most of the time. But what mattered to Zuckerberg was where those users were coming from. As he explained in a phone call or an email with his CFO that was later part of an evidentiary record, he was targeting Instagram because his own users were leaving Facebook and they weren't coming back. And so he wanted to buy Instagram so that after they left Facebook, they would still be Facebook users. That they could leave Facebook, the platform, but they could never escape Facebook, the company. Now, this is illegal, but no one stopped them doing it. In fact, for 40 years, starting with the Carter administration and up to but not including the Biden administration, we just let companies violate the black letter of antitrust law all the time. It was a free-for-all, grounded in a theory of economics called consumer welfarism that holds that monopolies are efficient. If you observe that everyone is using Google search, you should assume that the reason for that is not that Google search is cheating, but that Google has made the best search engine. And it would be perverse to allocate public funds to punishing Google for making the product that everyone likes the best. But as we know, after we saw the DOJ case this summer, Google did not maintain search dominance by being better than everyone else. They did it by paying bribes. $20 billion or more per year to Apple alone to pay them not to make a search engine and to make Google the default on every search. And billions more for Samsung, Mozilla, AT&T, anyone making a product or a service that had a search box on it, which ensured that you would never accidentally use a search engine that was better than Google, which in turn meant that no one would invest in making a search engine that was better than Google. Why bother making something better than Google if they bought up all the market oxygen that you would need to kindle your product to life? Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple, they're not making things companies, they are buying things companies, taking advantage of an official tolerance for anti-competitive acquisitions, predatory pricing, market distorting exclusivity deals, and other acts that are specifically prohibited by our existing antitrust law, which allows them to become too big to fail, which makes them too big to jail, which means that they are too big to care. Which is why Google search is a pile of shit and everything on Amazon is dropship garbage that turns into a pile of volatile organic compounds when you open the box and expose it to air. Once companies no longer fear losing your business to a competitor, it is easier for them to treat you badly, because what are you going to do when they treat you badly? Lily Tomlin used to do these fake AT&T ads for Saturday Night Live in the 70s, where she would play a Bell system operator extolling the virtues of the monopoly carrier. And at the end of every one of these fake ads, she would turn to the camera and say, "We don't care. We don't have to. We're the phone company. Google doesn't care. They don't have to. They have a 90% market share in search." So competition, markets, that's the first force that disciplines companies and the enshittificatory impulses of company leaders. And 40 years ago, we stopped enforcing competition law. Now, it takes a very special kind of smooth-brained expert, like an establishment economist, to insist that the collapse of every industry, from eyeglasses to vitamin C, from professional wrestling to cheerleading, from intermodal shipping to semiconductors, has nothing to do with 40 years of encouraging monopoly formation. It's like we used to put down rat poison and we didn't have rats. And then these guys came along and they said, "Why are you putting down rat poison? Are you sure rats are so bad?" And now rats are everywhere and they're eating our faces off. And they're like, "How do you know that has anything to do with our rat poison policies?" Maybe it does, but maybe we're just living through the age of the rat. Maybe the great forces of history are moving upon this moment to make rats fecund beyond all measure. Antitrust did not slip down a staircase and fall spine first on that stiletto. These guys stabbed it in the back and then they pushed it down the stairs. And when they killed antitrust, they also ended up killing regulation, which is the second force that disciplines companies, not just markets, but also governments. Now, regulation is possible, but only if a regulator is more powerful than the sector that they are trying to regulate. When a company is bigger than the government, it gets damned hard to credibly threaten that company with regulatory punishment, no matter what sins it commits. That's what protected IBM for all the years when it had its boot on the throat of America's tech industry. Did you know that from 1970 to 1982, the Department of Justice sued IBM for monopolizing tech? And for every year, for those 12 consecutive years, IBM spent more on lawyers to fight the DOJ than the DOJ spent on all the lawyers it employed to fight every antitrust case in the country. They outspent the US government for 12 consecutive years. They call that period Antitrust's Vietnam. And at the end of it, Ronald Reagan was elected. He called off the DOJ, and IBM wriggled off the hook. It's hard to regulate a monopolist, and it's hard to regulate cartels. When sectors are composed of hundreds of small competing companies, they're competing with each other. They are genuinely fighting with one another, trying to poach each other's best customers and best workers. They are at each other's throat. It is hard enough to get a couple hundred executives from a bunch of firms to agree on anything, but if they actually hate each other, if they're legitimately spending every day trying to figure out how to eat each other's lunches, they won't agree on anything. The second any one of them goes to a regulator with some kind of BS story about how it's impossible, for example, to have a decent search engine that doesn't spy on people, or how it's impossible to have an easy-to-use, secure device unless you get a total veto over all the software that can run on it, or how it's impossible to administer an ISP's network unless you can slow down connections to servers whose owners aren't willing to pay you a bribe for premium carriage. There would be some other companies saying, no, that's not true. We managed it. Here's our server logs. Here's our cache books. Here's our customer testimonials. 100 companies are a rabble. They are a mob. They can't agree on a lobbying position. They're too busy eating each other's lunches to agree on how they would cater a meeting where they would talk about a lobbying position. But let those 100 companies merge to a monopoly. Let them absorb one another in an incestuous orgy, turning into 5 giant companies so inbred they have Habsburg jaws, and they become a cartel. And it's easy for a cartel to agree on what line of BS they're going to feed their regulators and to mobilize the excess billions they retain because they don't have to waste it on wasteful competition fighting with one another. So they can capture their regulators completely. You know, in this country, Congress used to pass consumer privacy laws, but not anymore. The last time Congress passed a consumer privacy law in this country was in 1988, when they passed a law that prohibited video store clerks from telling newspapers which VHS cassettes you took home. 2.5 things that don't exist anymore. And yet, Congress has not passed a federal privacy law since, despite the myriad of new privacy challenges the public face. Tech companies' regulatory capture involves a risible and transparent gambit that is so stupid, it's an insult to all those hardworking, risible, transparent gambits out there. They claim that when they violate your consumer, your privacy, or your labor rights, that it's not a crime if they do it with an app. Algorithmic wage discrimination, that's not illegal wage theft. We did it with an app. Spying on you with every hour that God sends, not a privacy violation. We did it with an app. Amazon scam, where the search tool tricks you into spending 29% extra for everything you search for, it's not a ripoff. We did it with an app. Once we killed competition, we stopped putting down rat poison. And so we got cartels. The rats came and ate our faces. And the cartels captured the regulators. The rats bought the poison factory and dismantled it. So companies aren't constrained by regulation or by competition, by governments or by markets. But you know what? Tech is different. It's different because it's flexible. It's different because our computers are Turing-complete universal von Neumann machines. And that means that any enshittificatory alteration to a program or service can be disenshittified with another program that undoes the mischief. Every time HP is jacking up the price of ink, they're inviting a competitor to come in and make ink cartridge refills or a compatible cartridge. When Tesla puts code in a car that says you have to pay a monthly fee in order to use the entire charge in your battery, they invite a modder to start making kits that unlock the other half of your battery. So here's an example of how that works. Imagine instead of being at an ACM conference, we're planning our company's website. It's a product meeting. The person running the meeting, they say, okay, our KPI here is top line ad revenue. And I've calculated, doing some back of the envelope math, we can get an extra 2% in ad revenue merely by making the ads 20% more invasive and obnoxious. Now, at that point, someone around the table, someone who does not give a damn about their users' well-being or the quality of the product, might well put their hand up and say, Elon, I love how you think, but has it occurred to you that when we make the ads 20% more invasive and obnoxious, 40% of our users are going to go to the search engine and type, how do I block ads? And when they do that, the revenue from those ads, it doesn't stay at the status quo ante, right? We're not getting 100% of the revenue. We are not getting 102%, the revenue we're hoping to get. The revenue from those users goes to zero, and it never comes back. We never make a penny off of them because no user in history has ever gone back to the search engine and typed, "How do I start seeing ads again?" So, sorry, I just lost my place. Now, interoperability, this latent property bequeathed to us courtesy of Harris, von Neumann, and Turing, and their infinitely flexible universal machines, they constitute a serious check on enshittification. The fact that Congress hasn't passed a privacy law since 1988 is terrible, but it is in large part mitigated by the fact that 51% of all web users have installed a privacy blocker, an ad blocker, in their browser, the largest consumer boycott in human history. But no one has ever installed a privacy blocker on an app. And the reason they've never done that is Section 1201 of the 1998 Digital Millennium Copyright Act makes it a felony to bypass an access control, DRM, in the app, punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine for a first offense. And violating the terms of service, that puts you in jeopardy under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986, a law that Ronald Reagan passed in a panic after someone sat him down and made him watch War Games with Matthew Broderick. True story. Helping users violate their terms of service can get you pulled up for tortious interference with contract, and then there's trademark, copyright, and patent, all that nonsense that we collectively call it IP, but Jay Freeman calls this use of IP, he calls it felony contempt of business model, the ability to mobilize the state to make your commercial preferences a legal obligation on your competitors. So now we're back at that product planning meeting, and it's time to move on to our company's app. And the person who's designing the app, who's running the meeting, he says, okay, well, we're not going to be able to do this enshittification to the website, but surely we can make the ads in the app 20% more invasive and get 2% more revenue. And the guy put his hand up before, he says, why are you so timid? We should make the ads in the app 100% more obnoxious and get 10% more revenue, because it doesn't matter if the user goes back to the search engine and types, how do I block the ads in my app? Because the answer is you can't, right? An app is just a website skinned with the right kind of IP to make it a felony to protect your privacy when you use it, which is why everyone wants you to use their app and not their website. So interop used to keep companies from enshittifying. If companies made their clients suck, someone would roll out alternative clients. If they ripped a feature out and wanted to sell it back to you as an upsell, someone would make a compatible plugin and they would restore it for a one-time fee or just give it to you for free. When users wanted to flee MySpace to go to Facebook, Facebook gave them bots. You gave that bot your login credentials, your user and password, and it would go to MySpace on your behalf several times a day, scrape all the messages waiting for you at MySpace, put them in your Facebook inbox, let you reply to them there, and then autopilot them back into your MySpace outbox. So you did not have to choose between your friends and the superior service on Facebook, which was superior because Facebook's promise to the internet in 2006, when they opened up to the general public, is Facebook is better than MySpace because we will never spy on you. True story. Thanks to the metastasis of IP, all of that is off the table today. Apple owes its very existence to the iWork suite, which they created by reverse engineering Microsoft Office, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, and making Keynote, Numbers, and Pages so that they were file compatible. But if you made an iOS runtime today that could play back files that you bought from Apple's media stores, they would nuke you until you glowed. Facebook wouldn't have had a hope of breaking MySpace's enormous network effects and high switching costs without that scraper. But if you scrape Facebook today, they'll bomb you till the rubble bounces. Google scraped every website in the world to get kicked off. But if you try and scrape Google, they will put your head on a pike. Because when they did it, that was progress. And when you do it to them, that is piracy, because every pirate dreams of being an admiral. And because this handful of competitors has so thoroughly captured their regulators, they can wield the power of the state against you when you try to break their grip on power, even as their own flagrant violations of our rights go unpunished because they do them with an app. So tech lost its fear of competition. It neutralized the threat from regulators. It put the regulators in harness to attack potential competitors and who would come and do unto them as they had done unto the companies that came before them. But even then, there was one force that kept tech in check that stopped enshittification, and that was tech workers. Tech workers have historically been in greatly short supply, which gave them power, and their bosses knew it. To get tech workers to work crazy hours, bosses came up with a trick. They appealed to tech workers' love of technology and told them that they were heroes of a digital revolution who would, quote, organize the world's information and make it useful, or bring the world closer together. They brought in expert set dressers who transformed tech workplaces into whimsical campuses with free laundry, gourmet coffee, massages, kombucha, and a surgeon who would remove your eggs and freeze them so you could work through your fertile years. They convinced tech workers that they were being pampered and not that they were being worked like government mules. Now, this trick has a name. The librarian theorist Fobazi Ettar, she calls it vocational awe. But Elon Musk has a much more crude name for it. He calls it being extremely hardcore. Now, this trick worked very well. Tech workers put in some very long ass hours. But for bosses, the trick failed badly. Because if you miss your mother's funeral to ship a product on time, and then your boss orders you to enshittify that product, and you know you can get a job across the street that afternoon, you're going to experience a sense of moral injury, and you will make sure your boss experiences it with you. You will deny the request, and your boss has nowhere else to turn to do the work that you refuse to do. What are they going to do? Fire you? But eventually, supply catches up with demand. In 2023, 260,000 tech workers were fired in America. First half of 2024, another 100,000 were shown the door. So tech workers, they don't tell their bosses to go screw themselves because the boss will fire your ass and give your job to someone else who will be only too happy to enshittify the product you worked so hard to ship. That's why all of this is happening right now. Tech bosses are not different. They did not catch a mind virus that turned them into greedy jerks who don't care about users' well-being or the quality of the products that they ship. As far as tech bosses have always been concerned, the point of the business was to charge the most, deliver the least, and share as little as possible with suppliers, workers, and customers. They're not running charities. They're running for-profit enterprises. And since day one, they showed up for work, went to the C-suite, and yanked as hard as they could on the giant lever there marked enshittification. But that lever didn't move. It was stuck. It was gummed up by competition, by regulation, by interoperability, and by workers. And as these sources of friction melted away, the enshittification lever just started to move very freely. And this sucks, I know. But think about the bright side for 1 second. These bosses, despite being wildly imperfect vessels capable of rationalizing endless greed and cheating, nevertheless, once upon a time, presided over the creation and marketing of a series of actual great products and services, not because they used to be better people, but because they used to be subject to discipline. So it follows that if we want to end the enshitticene, if we want to dismantle the enshitternet, if we want to build a new good internet that tech bosses can't wreck, we need to make sure that the constraints that once exist are reinstalled on that new internet, wound around the roots and around its nerves. And then we have to stand guard over it so that it can't be dismantled again. A new good internet has the positive aspects of the old good internet, that ethos of technological self-determination, where users and hackers and tinkerers and startups and others who serve as proxies can reconfigure and mod services so that they do what users need them to do and so that they can't be used against them. But the new good internet will fix the defects of the old good internet, the part that made them hard to use for anyone who wasn't like us. And of course we can do that. Now, tech bosses will swear it's impossible, that you can't have a conversation with a friend without sharing it with Zuck, that you can't search the web without letting the Google boys look over your shoulder, or have a phone that works reliably without Apple having a veto over your software. They claim that it's a nonsense to even ponder this. It's like imagining water that isn't wet. But this is nonsense. We can have nice things. We can build things for the people that we love and give them a place worthy of their time and attention. To do that, we must install constraints. Now, the first constraint, remember, is competition. We are living through an epochal shift in the enforcement of competition law. After 40 years of antitrust enforcement being in an induced coma, a wave of antitrust vigor has swept through governments, not just here, but all over the world. Regulators are stepping in to ban monopolistic practices, to open up walled gardens, to block anti-competitive mergers, and even unwind the corrupt mergers that were undertaken on false pretenses. Now, just in August, we saw the DOJ win a monopolization case against Apple. And we are now seeing companies being scared away from even trying to monopolize, like Wiz, which in August noped out of the largest acquisition offer in history, turning down a $23 billion cash out from Google and decided to just, be a business that makes money by making a product that people want to use that they sell at a competitive price. In August, we saw the Judge Amit Mehta finding Google guilty of being a monopolist and contemplating remedies that are on the table today, including breaking the company up, which is pretty epic. Now, this antitrust stuff is pretty esoteric, and I won't gatekeep you or shame you if you want to keep some distance on this subject. Nearly everyone is an antitrust normie, and that is okay. But if you're a normie, you're probably only catching little pieces of this narrative. And let me tell you, the monopolists know that, and they flood the zone. Like the Wall Street Journal, which over the last 4 years published over 100 op-eds condemning Lena Khan, the wonderful head of the Federal Trade Commission, for being an ineffectual do-nothing, wasting public funds, chasing doomed quixotic adventures against poor innocent businesses, and getting nothing done. Now, Rupert Murdoch owns the Wall Street Journal, and he does not pay his editorial board to write 100 editorials about someone who's doing nothing. The reality is that in the USA, but also in the UK, and in the EU, and in Australia, and in Canada, even in China, we are seeing more antitrust action over the last 4 years than we saw in the last 40. And all that stuff is going to continue in 2025, even if the Trump administration drops it, because it's going to be happening elsewhere. Though, of course, the Trump administration might not drop it. Some of these cases actually started under the Trump administration, like the Google case. I think it'll be selective. I think they're going to go after companies that Trump doesn't like rather than companies that harm us the most. But it's a target-rich environment. And at the state level, well, there's a lot of reason to do antitrust, not least because you can take billions of dollars out of companies and put them in the state tax coffers, which is great, especially if you're in a state like Texas, where you're not taxing people and you still want to pave the roads. Remember, competition law is actually pretty robust. The problem isn't the law, it's the enforcement priorities. Reagan put antitrust in mothballs 40 years ago, but that elegant weapon from a more civilized age is now back in the hands of people who know how to use it, who swing for the fences. People like antitrust. They vote for candidates that talk about breaking corporate power. Regulation is also back on the scene. As the seemingly inescapable power of tech giants is revealed for the sham it always was, governments and regulators are finally up for killing the one weird trick of violating the law and saying it doesn't count if we do it with an app. So in Europe, we have the Digital Markets Act, which mandates APIs for interoperability, so that co-ops, nonprofits, startups, academic institutions can roll out things like an alternative to Facebook that you can leave Facebook and go to, but continue to talk to the people you left behind on Facebook. So the switching costs are effectively zero. That is a very cool rule, but what's even cooler is what the EU is doing about enforcement. So you may know that 8 years ago, the EU passed a privacy law called the GDPR. It's a pretty good law, but it's barely been enforced. And the reason it's barely been enforced is that in the EU, all the tech companies pretend that they're Irish because Ireland is a tax haven. And every tax haven is also a crime haven. Because if you attract a business that has so many lawyers and is so good with its org charts and spreadsheets that it can pretend to be Irish today, tomorrow it could pretend to be Cypriot or Luxembourgian or Dutch and move to another tax haven like Malta. And so you have to keep them there. And the way you keep them there is by not enforcing laws. And so for the last 8 years, every GDPR enforcement case has started with the Irish Data Commissioner, and usually it's just died there. The Irish Data Commissioner, to a first approximation, barely gets out of bed. And when they do, they sit around in their pajamas all day eating breakfast cereal and watching cartoons. And so it's taken 8 years for some of those cases to finally make it to the federal court. We're starting to see some enforcement. But with the DMA, the enforcement starts in the federal court because the European Commission knows this is going on. And here in the United States, we might finally be getting some privacy law. After all, there are lots of people who are really upset with stuff that has some nexus with America's privacy vacuum. If you think that Insta made your teenager anorexic, if you think that Facebook turned your grandpa into a QAnon, if you're worried that TikTok brainwashed the millennials in your life into quoting Osama bin Laden, or more serious stuff like cops rolled up the identities of all those Black Lives Matter protesters by serving reverse warrants on Google. And then they did the same thing to the January 6th rioters, or red state attorneys general follow people across state lines and into abortion clinics using data from tech platforms, or that racialized people are being discriminated against on lending and rental and job platforms, or that someone is making AI porn of you. These are all problems that start with the fact that we don't have a privacy law. And so the coalition for privacy law is building, and we are seeing a series of ever improving privacy bills being introduced in Congress and getting closer to the finish line. Now, I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It's a nonprofit that's been working on these issues for 30 years, and I've been there for 25 of them. And if you sign up for our mailing list at EFF.org, we'll let you know when there's state privacy laws or federal privacy laws that are relevant to you. And you can go and talk to your lawmaker and say, I'm a computer scientist, and I think this is a good idea. Now, on self-help, on interrupt, we're also seeing progress. And that's mostly coming through the right to repair laws that are happening at the state. The Oregon right to repair law bans parts pairing. It bans using DRM for components because they can't override federal law. If you go to repair.org, you can find out more about these state right to repair laws. And the final way that we reverse enshittification and build a new good internet is with the tech labor force. For years, they were tricked by their bosses into thinking that they were founders in waiting, temporarily embarrassed entrepreneurs who are only momentarily drawing a salary, and certainly not workers who might benefit from a union. That was a trick. It was a scam. If power comes from scarcity, then when scarcity ends, power goes away too. Solidarity is the only durable source of power for workers. Think about Amazon, right? Jeff Bezos and Andy Jassy do not allow their tech workers to come to the shop every day with a pink mohawk and facial piercings and black t-shirts that say things that their bosses don't understand because they're sentimental about programmers. They do it because they're afraid that those programmers will quit. And we know how those companies treat workers they're not afraid of. You just have to look at Amazon drivers and Amazon warehouse workers, people who pee in bottles and have 3 times the industry rate of on-the-job crippling injuries that are career-ending. Those workers, they're on the bleeding edge of the treatment of tech workers in the future. Right? William Gibson says the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. Well, these guys are living in a pretty thick pool of futurism. Or look at Tim Cook, right? The reason Tim Cook was chosen to succeed Steve Jobs as the head of Apple is because he figured out how to outsource manufacturing to China and to maintain quality by finding subcontractors whose conditions were so brutal that they had to install suicide nets because workers were driven to kill themselves. That's what Tim Cook does to workers he's not afraid of. And he's not afraid of tech workers, that's what he'll do to them. Right? It's not like there's any intrinsic difference. So this is why we're seeing more and more work on tech unionization. Tech workers have spent their careers explaining in words so small their bosses can understand them, why they shouldn't enshittify their products. We should thank them for their service, but if they're going to fight for the user, they're going to need something more durable than scarcity. And so tech solidarity and other tech unionization drives are a source of enormous important power. Enshittification did not happen because our bosses changed. Our bosses were always that guy, always yanking on the enshittification lever. What changed was the environment, everything that kept the lever from moving, which is good news in a bank shot way, because it means we can have good services with imperfect people. And as a wildly imperfect person myself, it's heartening. The new good internet is in our grasp, an internet that has the technological self-determination of that old good internet and the grease-skid simplicity of Web 2.0. Let the normie friends get in on the fun. Tech bosses want us to think that good UX and enshittification can't ever be separated, but it's such a self-serving proposition, we can spot it from orbit. We know it. We were there when they built the old good internet. We've been fighting a rearguard action to preserve it for decades. It's time to stop playing defense and go on the offense, restoring competition, regulation, interop, and tech worker power, so that we can build that new good internet, which we are going to need if we're going to fight fascism, the climate emergency, and genocide, to have a digital nervous system for a 21st century where our children will thrive and prosper. Thank you.